Welcome everyone to the Esri Developer Summit 2021. Today we'll be looking at enterprise JavaScript, testing more and working less. My name is Randy Jones. I'm a technical lead and a software developer in Esri's professional services division, and I'm based out of our DC regional office. I'm joined today by Jackie Roberts.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jackie Roberts, a front-end software developer and team lead in professional services, also based out of the DC office. Today, Randy and I are going to walk through some testing best practices and then demo adding various types of tests into a couple enterprise applications. We'll start with context setting and the basics, and for that, I'll turn it over to Randy.
This is a talk that we've given in previous years. Jackie and I take your feedback every year and integrate it into the things that you want to hear and focus on for future to integrate into your workflows. So let's think about what we did last year. We talked about basic ground rules for testing, how we're going to focus on test-driven development and building our unit tests, and how we incorporate those things into our legacy applications. Let's think about what we're going to walk through this year. We're going to start with test-driven development, and we're going to give some practical guides on when you can do that and when it's less practical as well. We're going to review our testing ground rules. We're going to look at unit testing and our legacy apps, and we're going to get deeper into end-to-end testing. This will allow you to fully automate your testing suite and give you a good sense of your application working from your user's perspective. We'll be using various tools, including Selenium and other testing frameworks that Jackie will be showing you. So when we talk about test-driven development, this is always something that is a best practice that developers should be integrating into their development cycle. It is something that takes practice, but is not always something that is practical given your project size, your project team, or if you're trying to start with a legacy application that already exists. So how do we test? Commonly, what we see developers do is they write their code and then they write their tests. The code then break when they modify and update it. That test is then broken. So then we rewrite the test to meet the new guidelines of the code. The problem is this is the opposite of what we should be doing. We end up in a situation where our code is driving our tests instead of our tests driving our code. When we look at the ideal design for test-driven development, we're working first from our goal, which is our test, and then writing our code to pass it. So when we implement this in practice, we're writing our tests, and they're immediately going to fail because we don't have any code yet to support them. As we begin to build our code, keeping in mind our ultimate goal, which is captured in our test, we begin to see this development practice meeting and doing good. We continue this process of writing tests, writing small bits of code to test that, to pass that test, and then we continue to refactor our code to meet the needs and better encapsulate each small test and small piece of code that we're going for. But today, we're going to start to think about things from our legacy applications. This can be a huge undertaking applying this to existing code. So we'll give you some practical guide on understanding what you should be testing, how to incorporate this process into an existing application so that you can leave your code better than you found it. Let's set up some ground rules here so that we know what we should be testing and how we should be testing. Our very first rule is to think about what we should be testing. We certainly need to be testing our code and the code that we're writing. We should avoid writing tests that have dependencies on other people's code and is testing other people's code. Whenever we do this, we start testing the wrong things. When we incorporate libraries and other people's code, they should be performing these same sorts of tests that we're writing for our code. There's a certain amount of trust in the developer community that we have to rely on here. Sure, we might occasionally find bugs in other people's code and report them, and maybe we need to do something so that we know when that code has been corrected in future releases. But by and large, we need to make sure that we're testing that right code. The second thing that we need to always consider is a prioritization of what is most important. Expecting that developers will get 100% code coverage isn't always the best use of our time and money. Developers cost money, time costs money, especially if we're developing things that have some sort of monetary aspect to them. So we need to think about how we prioritize that code that needs to be tested. This also gets into the type of testing that we might choose. When we look at the ideal test pyramid here, we see that we have different levels of testing. Each level of this testing, starting at the bottom with unit tests, tests a bigger and bigger piece of our code and has added complexity and cost when we look at the tests. Unit tests are what we described before. They're very small encapsulated pieces of code and tests that we're writing. As we get up the stack of the pyramid here, we ultimately come into functional tests. This is usually done with the full user interface, and these tests are usually more fragile and costly. Jackie will show us today how we can use Selenium on the functional testing side to hopefully reduce some of those costs and complexity, but know that if tests are going to break, these are the ones that are most likely going to take, but there can be some great benefits to having them. Down at the bottom, we'll also look at unit tests and how testing frameworks that we have can help us write unit tests, help developers ensure that their code is returning proper results, and has a high likelihood of integrating into the larger code base. Unfortunately, though, getting the pyramid wrong is all too common. We work toward getting a large single functional test. It hasn't passed in a long time. And even initial tests aren't truly end-to-end because they either don't touch the UI or they don't test the proper parts of our code. So this is where we need to think of both our rules 1 and 2, where we prioritize the right sets of code and we are testing our bits of the code. So the best way for us to start writing these tests is to continue to remember to encapsulate our tests. We're encapsulating our code so that we are testing each bit of functionality in small functions. This might mean that we need to refactor our code to remove loops into their own function so that we can test its logic versus having it be in a big large code block. So this could be true for events, callbacks, loops, as I mentioned. So next time you go to write a really large function, a really large block of code, try writing those tests first. Think about what you need to test within this block of logic and break out each of those steps, each of those blocks into their own test and then their own code block. This way, you're writing code that fits the test that you've just written. You're not trying to jam everything into one big piece of logic, and things are more isolated. And this will also result often in more readable code, less spaghetti code, as we like to say. So as we continue to test things and build out our tests, this also makes our code easier to maintain. It isolates where failures occur into smaller bits that developers or new developers to projects can easily find, maintain that piece of code, and understand what code changes break logic changes. So now that we've laid our groundwork, thinking about not testing other people's code, prioritizing both the code that we test and testing it at the right level, and encapsulating our code and tests so that we have easily maintainable things, we're going to look at an example here. So I'm going to turn it over to Jackie, and she's going to show us an example of just an enzyme as we look at integrating these into a legacy application.
Thanks, Randy. All right, everybody. So I'm really excited for this today. Test from the start. Absolutely. As Randy mentioned earlier, this is something that test-driven development, you write the test first and then you write the code to pass it. And so this is the point where if we were in person, I'd poll the audience and ask by show of hands, how many folks are working on a legacy code base? Based on the typical developer experience, I'd venture a guess that most of us have at some point in our careers, if not doing so today, been on a project where we're adding on to something that's been around for years. So testing from the start can mean a few things. Last year we demoed writing tests on a new feature of a new application. And this year I'm going to walk through setting up a unit test from the perspective of a dev who's working on a legacy React application and wanting to get some unit test coverage on functionality that currently exists. This is the kind of practice that sets up the project team for future members or future functionality. Making sure we capture what's currently working so that any changes in the future are compatible and don't break existing workflows. Before we get into the testing frameworks, let's take a peek at this legacy application to give some context on why we're going to work with the unit and functional testing frameworks we do. So before I show my IDE in the browser to just kind of show you this end result of the application as it exists, a quick breakdown. There's essentially two parts here. We have a standalone editor React application. That's an ejected React app created with the Create React App CLI using class-based components. It's several years old, and it displays current announcements stored on Portal. I'll show you how we do this. The second application is a Portal announcement Modal that pops up when users first visit the home page. This is built off of vanilla JavaScript that's inserted into some of the Portal Enterprise files. It stores hidden values in a config class that we put in the organization description as an admin. And then the JavaScript just loops over that config and creates a dialog on the DOM with, a title, date, and description for each announcement. So to give you an overview of what this looks like, I'll go over here. Here's the editor announcements. And then here on my home page, right here, is where that announcement shows up. And what we've done is we've taken on the home page as an administrator, going down here, I've hidden this HTML source elements. I've hidden this class called announcements config display none. And it's basically, it looks scary right now, but it's this big JSON object with a bunch of different attributes that we loop over to get our announcements. So right now for this first part with unit tests, I'm going to focus on the editor React application. Looking at this, I can see it's displaying the active announcements. I can add announcements, cancel. I can edit announcements, save or cancel. So those are kind of the basic functionality there. If I go over to my IDE, taking a look up here, we have our source. So within here, we have, a typical React application has this entry point in app.js. It's basically an application that's going to load that portal description, and it has 3 states, whether it's, viewing the active announcements, creating new announcements, or editing the announcements. And then in true React fashion, we have different components for the header, which is either going to display the active announcements. If that payload from the organization description, maybe that gets messed up, maybe it gets fat-fingered, so maybe there's some error handling if there's some sort of JSON syntax error, or we're adding or editing an announcement. When we're creating the announcement, we have some basic functionality. We need to render those inputs, those text inputs. If it's editing, we need to pull in the values that are already stored for the date, description, and text. And then we need to be able to save it. And then last but not least, when we're looking at the active announcements list, again, we saw it from the end use case. We can either be adding on, we can be creating, or we can be deleting from them. So this is just the general outline right there. When we're taking a look at getting set up with this, there's a couple things we have to do. This application needs to point to your portal, wherever that URL is, as well as whatever JS API URL you are using. Some folks are hosting their JS API URL, some are using just public open ones, so that's just some config right there. So when I look at this, I'm going to go ahead up to here, and I just went ahead, I installed it, and I ran npm start. So I have my local host, because we're going to go ahead and get started with adding on some unit tests. So this was the hosted one. Now I'm going to pull this over here. Here's my local host. Here's what I'm working with as I add on these tests. So I log in, and let's say the first thing I want to do, the basic thing I want to do, is add an announcement, right? So I'm on this initial load of the page, and with taking a step back, I just want to start, with this application and say, so why Enzyme? I understand the application. I understand what it's going to do. I'm new to this project, but I'm about to add some features, and I want to capture what it does. Given that I know that it's a React app built with the Create React App CLI, Jest and Enzyme come with this nearly out of the box. Jest, as a review, is a lightweight, simple JavaScript testing framework that's compatible with all sorts of projects. So for demo purposes, a lot of us could use something like this in our projects regardless of what framework we're using. Enzyme is another testing utility specifically for React applications that allows us to test our React components output. Its API mimics jQuery's API for DOM manipulation and traversal. So when we look at the testing framework and these unit tests, it's a simple, you can group your related tests by wrapping them in a describe, it, or test blocks. Typically, within those functions, you just put some sort of descriptive string for what that atomic test should be focused on. Then you have your expect for the global function and making assertions. And then last but not least, to create spies and mock-out functions, we have just.function and expect that function to be called. So it reads pretty well, pretty simple, just as a refresher. Lots of folks will ask us, can I React or Angular or Vue or new trendy framework? And absolutely. In fact, most languages now have CLIs that stub out the skeletal architecture, which allows for incorporating testing frameworks rather easily. If you're starting from scratch, start with a CLI. These days, most JavaScript web apps are built with a framework and start from there. And then the boilerplate gets ripped out and replaced as the app gets built. Jest is fairly agnostic to the framework, and so for the majority of the demo today, I'll focus on adding Jest-based test for that reason. Enzyme specifically tests some React components and does some cool stuff for us, so we're not asserting certain things on the children of React components. So I'll incorporate a couple flavors there, but for the most part, we'll have some Jest test. So now we're going to get into the actual application. We kind of understand its structure and what it's doing. And now we're going to go ahead and incorporate some of those unit tests. All right, so the great thing here is, you know, we can npm install Jest, we can npm install Enzyme. Because this is a Create React app built application, a lot of this has already come out of the box for us. One thing that you may find yourself having to do with setup is going through, after, you know, installing the npm Jest and Enzyme. If you need to do that, you may need to go over to your source folder and create a file called setuptest.js. From here, after you've installed Enzyme, you just need to configure the adapter for your application, and it's these 3 simple lines of code. So you're importing configure and adapter, and then configuring it right here. And that'll allow for some of the cross-test components to work. So we have our application, and Jest and Enzyme as testing libraries, they're looking for, there's a couple ways you can set this up, but essentially you need some sort of test folder in a certain format, as well as your tests in a certain file name convention. For today, I chose the double underscores with tests. So under components, this Jest and Enzyme, they're going to automatically understand how to read that, okay, tests, I can go in here and look for this, so long as each one is labeled as .test.js. So the first one I started out with was apptest.js. I have mine running locally on port 3000. And right now, I can run test. I have these kind of stubbed out because I want to create a test suite for each of my components here and keep those nice and separated. And you can see as it runs through each test suite, nothing, it's all commented out for now, so they're all going to fail, right? So when we're thinking about test-driven development and starting from the beginning, right now we're capturing what already exists. But we can still kind of have this backwards by design. We have the goal already, the functionality is there. So if we're looking at this, you know, announcements list on app.js, okay, the first thing that we really want is to make sure that it renders. So for all of our tests, we have to import React. For Enzyme, one thing that I do like to use is shallow. This shallow rendering allows you to render whatever component you're testing and make sure that your tests don't have like trickle down behavior on child components. So it's really nice to get that atomic testing. And then importing whatever your component is that you're testing. So right here, I went ahead, I'm going to reuse these mock props and this shallow app. And the first one I do, just making sure it renders. So because I ran npm test, the moment I save, you know, it's watching for file changes here, and it goes ahead and says test 1 now passed, because essentially I have 1 test. These are the 4 failed test suites that I have stubbed out with nothing in them yet, so they fail by default. When we're looking at the rest of this page, I think this is where it's like, okay, so I'm not adding new functionality right now. I'm just capturing and testing what's currently there. So if I have a new team member like myself join the team and I write some new feature or refactor something, I don't break it. So let's capture what it does. On this page, it needs to render the loading indicator when loading. So that's, you know, essentially, let's make that portal load status loading, set the state with those mock props, and then expect it to find that loader. That little element is called loader, so it knows how to find that, and expect that its length in that DOM will be 1. So when I go ahead and press that, I now have my second test. It runs through, and there it is. 2 more tests that I've added onto this page. I need to render all active announcements once the portal's loaded, right? That's the first thing I should be seeing. So success, let's get the active list. And that means that header for an active announcement should be there. And then we also, on the, you know, that's the easy happy path. It works. We also need some test coverage on what if we fat fingered something in the org description, that big JSON object. It would be easy to mess that up, and it failed. So now we need to make sure that we're looking for this one attribute. If that's there, that means it failed. So if I go over, this one was kind of just a way to show you multiple things or multiple elements within the DOM that you could look for. So by Calcite H2, this Calcite React, it's a private library that we have in here to get some Calcite React components that look like the rest of Portal. But for the most part, this is just really saying, okay, under Calcite H2 in app.js, that's really like, okay, it didn't work out for us. So that is just one way to show you that it can look for those elements right there. So if I save that, I now have pretty good coverage on the overall app right there, and they're all passing. If I go back to my browser, let's say, okay, now I want to add one, right? So add or edit an announcement. With TDD, I would have written these tests before I wrote this code. Since I have the code already, I can at least take a look at this as an end user and kind of capture some of the things that are here, right? So I should be able to, I can't press save until all elements are filled out, right? I could press cancel. I could edit it and that stuff is pre-filled what's there. So already I'm getting a feel for like, what does this do as is and what are some of those workflows that I should capture as they currently exist. So going to create announcements. Again, the first one that I typically start out with is just making sure that it renders, again, using that shallow property from Enzyme. So the first one, make sure the save button's disabled when the announcement is incomplete for a new announcement. The last thing we want to do is have the end application break because something wasn't set up correctly. So if we take a look at this test right here, we again get that shallow wrapper around create announcement. We set up some mock props and set the state. Then we're saying, okay, we're expecting for this right here, because the description was left empty, it's a halfway complete announcement. That means that save button should be disabled. We shouldn't have that. It shouldn't be there for us. There we go. All right, a couple other tests we're going to throw in here. Now on the converse, I typically, what's the happy path? What's the sad path? When the save button is enabled, when the announcement is complete, similar thing, okay, we have two values for title and description. We're going to set that state with those mock props around that shallow component. And now our save button is there. And then last but not least, I'll just show these two together. Clicking the save button will save the announcement, and clicking the cancel button will cancel the announcement. So here I've set up a couple mock functions so that, we, on the create announcement component from here, I'm going to go in and call that save announcement and set that, but I really just, want to mock that out using that shallow create announcement so I haven't affected any children components. I'm going to find that save button and, mimic clicking it and make sure it's been called. On the converse, going through, finding the cancel announcement, setting up that mock function, finding that element, the cancel button, mimic clicking it, and expecting that to have been called. So right now, we have what we need from here. We can go ahead up to our active announcements test. So this, again, just as a reminder, I'm coming back to my legacy app. When I'm incorporating unit tests for something that already exists, there's a lot of, let's take a look at what this is doing so I can kind of just from like the general, basic understanding, what is it that I should be seeing? So when this loads, I should be seeing a list of active announcements, right? Okay, let me add in one more test announcement, number 2. Upgrade was a success. geocoder to be upgraded at a later date. So saving that right there. Excellent. I have my two announcements. They're there. Again, I could add, I could edit, I could delete. And this is the active announcements right here. The only other scenario that would really show up would be if I had gone over to here into organization, and for whatever reason, maybe I tried to edit something from here, maybe I copied, pasted it incorrectly. But when I put it in here, let's say I messed something up, right? So we don't want that, but it happens. People edit stuff, fat finger, they're human errors all the time. So now when I come over here, this shouldn't be displaying those anymore. If I look at this, excellent, I'm getting some error feedback. So that's another thing that I want to make sure that I've captured as well. All right, so before we proceed, let's just fix it real quick. I'm going to go over and grab just a sample in the docs folder. That sample div JSON object. Go back over here and set it up correctly again. Perfect, that's back. I reload, and that's back there. All right. So bringing up VS Code. On my active announcements test, as always, starting with that shallow active announcements, making sure it renders without crashing. All right, then displays all announcements in a calcite React list. Again, this is just expecting what we've already set up to have those in there. So let's display those when we first hit. I'm going to mount with theme this active announcements, the current announcements being these mock announcements right here. So it's a little hard to tell, but when we look at this announcements config test, essentially we might have a couple other attributes. Users might have all sorts of other things that they put in their org description settings, and really we're just using regular expression matching to get down to whatever this class is, announcements config, that's hidden. And let's strip all of this away and get into this array right here. This array of objects which are an announcement that includes date, title, and description. So again, mounting with a theme for the active announcements, getting those mock announcements, and then finding that list item to be greater than or equal to 2 based on the number of mock announcements that we put in there. If there are no active announcements, then we want to make sure that, okay, it's less than 1, right? 0. We've gone ahead and within current announcements put 0 in there, right? Just that empty string, and made sure that that displays as well to test for that. That's one of those edge cases. Make sure that there's 0, make sure that there's 1 or more. And then last but not least, I went ahead and added in some tests right here so that if I get my active announcements with the current mock announcements in there, and I find that instance of it, I want to create a delete spy on the instance delete announcement. That delete announcement being a function coming from one of the other active announcements functions in there. So, instance delete announcements, and then I expect it to have been called. Perfect. Same deal down here. If I display edit, if I want to click, I want to make sure that there is the edit buttons showing up on each announcement within this list. Get that active announcements with those current announcements and find the pencil icon, which is something that we had brought in from Calcite React, to be greater than or equal to 2, just matching, putting in 2 tests up here, so matching that it's 2 up there, so each one has it. So going through and saving that. And then let's take a look at the header test. So again, that header really being like, hey, you're here, welcome. Here's the active announcements, or we're editing or adding a new announcement, or hey, there's some sort of error. making sure it renders. And then, for time's sake, going through these right here. So we created this as one unit test. This obviously could be broken up, but again, for time's sake, what we're doing here is rendering the header based on the status property. So if it's an active list, show active announcements. If it's in editing, show the add or edit announcements header. And if there was that syntax error, someone fat-fingered something or copy-pasted incorrectly, make sure it gives that error status. And then as you can see, kind of going through down here, it's still saying 2 failed, 2 passed, 1 failed, 13 passed. So there are a couple of things we can do. I'll get towards this in the end. I am paying attention to this right here, but it's something we'll address in just a moment. So last but not least, you can see down here, I have my utils, announcement utilities, JavaScript file, and this is kind of just, this is all of the logic behind the scenes, kind of working with whatever's happening when we store, when we update, create, read, delete, any of the announcements that's getting stored on that organization description text. So the first thing that has to happen is, okay, it has to be of a certain date format. And if you've ever worked with dates, which I'm sure many of us have, you know those can be in all sorts of different dates. And really it's just saying, okay, this app is going to create a new date, but then it needs to get formatted into the date that that portal modal expects so that it's showing up as is. So really it's just saying, okay, call the format date and expect this to be turned into this right here. Perfect. Then looking back at, okay, what again? Backwards by design, what's the end goal? What's the current functionality? I need to build an announcement, right? And then I need to add an announcement to that portal description that gets stored on portal's org description text. So looking at these two together, I have my title, description, date. That is my built announcement. I need to call this function from announcement utils, and I need it to equal whatever I'm creating right here. It needs to look like this built announcement. That is what that array is expecting to get added on. And then after I have that announcement built out and added onto the array, I need to set it back into this structure right here with like the div class and whatever regular expression matched, you know, blob of stuff that came before the announcement dialog and whatever comes after it towards the end of my closing div. So that's this right here is just going through, and that add announcement goes ahead and says, okay, here's the current list, here's the expected list, let's go ahead and add that on with those values. There we go. And then I'll go ahead and speak, just looking at the time, I'll go ahead and speak to a couple of these. So there's a lot of stuff that happens. We'll stop right here. There's a lot of stuff that happens over these next 3 tests, and there's a lot of stuff that happens in the organization description text box when you're, if you saw earlier, when you're editing that HTML source, there's a lot of escaped characters that get introduced. So between, you know, this standalone application and Portal's homepage, that JavaScript file, there's a lot of back and forth and just kind of cleanup that needs to happen. So that's a lot of what this utilities file is doing to make sure that the payload is in the expected format and works appropriately across the 2. A couple other tests for test coverage: delete announcement from portal description. We have our current list, we have our expected list, and then the way this application works is the unique ID is created by appending the date that it was created to its title. And so we want to say if we delete from portal based on this announcement ID, it better look like what we expected it to look like. It matched appropriately. A couple other tests that we have right here, checking if the date format is valid, giving a couple options that are either going to be true or false. and then cleaning up the HTML and white space in the portal description. So again, going back to, you see all this div class, config, display none, help link. If we clean up the description just to get that array of announcements that we want, that's right there, it's really saying, okay, if I remove this HTML and I remove any crazy white space that was added in there, does that clean description come out as we expect it to? All right, so we have this one failed test right here, one failed test suite because of that one failed test. So one thing we can do is we can press W to show more. And let's say, okay, let's focus on that failed test. It's in createannouncements.test.js. So looking at this save button with .props, method props is meant to run on one node, 0 found instead. So if we're looking at this right here, let's go to create announcements and create announcements.test.js. And see. Oh, it's because I changed the name of the save button node. That's why. So updating that, it's going to find that and then be able to run. All right, perfect. So now that we've gone over incorporating unit tests into the announcements editor, let's go ahead, switch back to the PowerPoint presentation, and take a look at acceptance tests. So here we're going to be looking at the first year that we've really gotten into functional tests. And I'm going to caveat that this will be a shallow first step given the level of effort that end-to-end testing can take in its setup and maintenance. So thinking back to the testing pyramid, functional tests really are at the top and overall require the most level of effort. Today, I'm going to be showing you Selenium Testing. So this is a tool set for web browser automation testing, and it can simulate common actions taken by end users, like clicking buttons, entering text, selection drop-down values, etc. Selenium is a powerhouse in browser-based testing. It's widely respected, and lots of enterprise businesses and applications use it. Given the level of effort to host and maintain Selenium WebDriver and end-to-end test, it's important to ask yourself if your application really needs a browser to test its functionality. And what we're really asking here is, do users interact with this application in the browser? Is it large scale? If so, then yes. And do you have the capacity to add this in? Yes, you need this, right? Today we'll walk through using the Chrome extension of the Selenium IDE to quickly develop end-user test cases, which can then be exported and saved to your project. So just some quick level setting. A lot of times you'll hear acceptance testing, functional testing, end-to-end testing, performance testing. We're really focusing on automating testing of the user expected behavior today, that acceptance testing, and using that IDE. Here, I'm going to go to that second application, that second legacy application, the portal announcement modal. And just review, acceptance testing focuses on the end results of the application and drives at the question of, are we building the right product? We simulate user expected behavior, which could be done manually and often is by some tester or developer. And then this acceptance testing is really a subtype of functional testing, and again, sometimes used interchangeably, but in the end, our focus is to test if the feature or application functions properly without issues when we run through it as an end user. Before we ever get into end-to-end tests, it's a best practice, again, to ask yourself, can this be accomplished by lighter weight unit tests? Looking back at the announcement modal, this is where the main purpose of our project lies, alerting user of important upcoming announcements like upgrades, outages, impacted services, gathering user feedback via surveys. So this is really the meat and potatoes of what we need to get to our users. So with that, a lot of people are like, okay, it is worth investing the time and effort to get some end-to-end tests set up here. So I'll quickly demo using the Chrome extension of Selenium IDE to set up some end-to-end tests. before I do so, let me go ahead and show you the basic layout of this application, the portal announcements application. So in the README, really, it's, alert users of different things. Might want to back up some original files like the home page or portal's underlying config.js. I need to configure a couple things in the config/default.js just to point to the right location of where it needs to go. Okay, and then what I can do is I can stop portal. I can run npm install to install this application, deploy it, restart portal. I've already done that, so we don't have to wait on it. And then, this deploy just a bunch of node scripts to get those inserted into the home page and in the config file. So the first thing here is really on the home page, what it's going to do is it's going to say, get that announcements config and go ahead and initialize the dialog once we get that config. So what that's doing is, hey, okay, go ahead to the org description text and query for that div class that we've hidden in there called announcements config. And then once we get it, parse over that returned inner text from that node list. Once we got that, we can go ahead and pass that config payload over to the dialog. And this dialog, really what it's doing is it's setting up the button in the top nav so that you can open up any announcements. And then it's saying, okay, let's get this current announcements list. And what we'll do is we'll start looping over them and creating the DOM elements for that modal. So we'll have, our title, we'll have announcement content and items where they're built out by the date, the announcement, title, description. Then going over, if we wanted to make it so that users only saw that announcement when there were new announcements, we're including a checkbox so that, some sort of cookie can be created and it doesn't pop up every time unless there's something new to show. And then last but not least, if there's, if there's nothing in that announcements array payload, let's say that there are no active announcements and it gets initialized. So that's the general structure of this right here. Again, in the default.json, I've gone ahead and set up the path to my local portal, and that's really all I had to configure there before deploying it. All right, so going back over, I have installed the Selenium IDE right here. So what's really awesome about this is going to show us very quickly how we can get used to the syntax language structure and start writing our own tests by acting out and recording as an end user. So let's go ahead. I'll sign out right here. That's right there. Perfect. I'm just going to, we'll make it no active announcements, no active announcements. Okay, perfect. So I go ahead and I open this up. I'm going to record a new test in a new project. We'll call it Test More, Work Less. And the base URL, let's go ahead. This is just like, okay, when Selenium opens up my, the web browser for Chrome, where's it starting? And I'll start recording. So it's going to run through and start acting that out. And then as the end user, I'm just walking through and clicking on the different elements that I need. Okay, so really what I want is I want this to display right here, no active announcements, excellent, and I can close it. Perfect. I'm going to go back over here, stop the recording, test name, no active announcements on entry. Okay. And then you can see just by clicking through right there, when I run this, it can go ahead and run through this test again for me and tell me quickly whether it passed. So once I have a working test, I can then come to here and I can export this. Again, so with Selenium, this powerhouse, you have lots of different options here. You could set up a Selenium server with Selenium Grid if you want to have some, remotely distributed systems for really large scale applications and get these worked into your automated test builds. You could focus on a Selenium server that just focuses on one language. So rather than importing the jar file that would encapsulate, C Sharp, Java, Python, JavaScript, Ruby, whatever kind of specs you need, you could have all of those with the jar file, or you can just focus on whatever language you want. Here it's a JavaScript web application, so I'm going to go ahead and click that, and I'll also include the origin tracing code comments and that start description as a separate comment, so I can kind of read through as I'm learning about this framework and how to use it and write these kinds of tests. So I'll export that. I'll go to desktop, I'll go to Dev Summit, and I'll just go ahead and throw this in here so I can have that. So I've done that, and then I'm going to open it. And let's take a look at what this looks like and walk through that. All right, so this test case for this specific workflow, no active announcements on entry, goes ahead and just by walking through and clicking as an end user would, sets up the test case for me. So I have my builder by key util all coming with the Selenium WebDriver. So in JavaScript, you can just npm install Selenium WebDriver, and then assert, right? Assert being the typical flow that we go through here. So this was just a very simple workflow that we wanted to test. Describe no active announcements on entry. Okay, so we go there, we open, no active announcements on entry. I'm able to navigate to my home page. It opens up the browser for me. I need to find that element. When I click it, okay, perfect, it's there. When I close it, okay, perfect, that happens. And so that can automate some of that stuff here. Obviously, we can get a lot more complicated with this. In the repo for our project, where you can access this announcements editor and portal announcements applications, I'll also include a couple more of these automated Selenium tests that were written via the Selenium IDE for you. So there will be a couple more in there. The last thing to show really was, for Selenium and test automation, I think the thing that's really important to think about is, again, getting to this test pyramid. Using this IDE as a Chrome extension, exporting those files, super simple. We're just getting our feet wet here. When we get into setting up the WebDriver, a little bit more of a complicated workflow, but something that on enterprise scale applications is worth it. We do this on my projects. When you get to Grid, this is running test cases in different machines across different platforms. So this is even larger scale, more grandiose, going to require more time, right? But it just kind of depends on where you are in your testing process. So if you're getting started, the IDE is a great way to go. If you're comfortable with that and really want to set some more up and take it to the next level, this is something that we hope to dive into more next year, but just setting the groundwork here this year with IDE. All right, so that wraps up the demos today on Test More, Work Less. I hope you found this information useful and can take it back to your own projects so that future you has less of a headache. Here's a list of resources for the frameworks, libraries, and demo projects we used today, specifically calling out that all slides and applications can be found at the GitHub repo for Dev Summit 2021 Test More, Work Less. And with that, I'll turn it over to Randy for any closing thoughts.
Well, thanks, Jackie. Jackie and I, every year that we do these presentations, really desire your feedback. So leave us comments on the videos, or you can hit us up on Twitter. We are always excited to help developers and help our Esri developer community increase their effectiveness in delivering quality applications to the user communities that they're serving. So thanks, Jackie, for walking us through adding unit tests to existing applications. We have a really detailed React example, and we have a really great start to integrating end-to-end testing for our users. That's both a great way to test whether your application is operating properly, but you can always use it as well to validate your system configurations as well. So think about creative ways that you can integrate these testing options into your own projects. We look forward to hearing from you and look forward to seeing you again in person in the future. Thank you everyone for your time today. Have a great Esri Developer Summit in our virtual 2021 format.